Hello, and welcome to Wendy's Workshop. Today's video was created out of necessity. The faux leather technique itself is not mine. I borrowed it from Izzy Bee Craft Creations, and I'll link her video below. The inside I created to track RV parks and specific campsites. Those of you who enjoy camping or RVing will totally get what this little book is about. But even if you don't, you can use this same idea for any journal or faux leather cover. When we stop at an RV park, we scope out the entire place while we're there to see if there's a site we like better than the one we were assigned. If we find one, we then circle it on the park map, and then we know where we want to stay next time. Or if we totally hate the place and we want to try someplace different when we go through that state again, we need to memorialize that in some way. When we did our last trip from Tennessee to California and back, I was left with a drawer full of maps with notes on them. So I came up with this RV campsite tracker. The tracker is set up like an address book, but you could do it by state if you wanted to. Mine's alphabetical. Each entry allows me to note the name and address of the particular RV park, a rating of 1 to 5 stars, and any area attractions we might want to hit. There's also a place for the favorite site numbers, a small section for notes where we can maybe list a favorite restaurant or hiking trail. I did create a free printable for this, and I'm going to leave a link to that below. The printable is created on Publisher, so if you have a duplexing printer, you should be able to print it back to back. Mine was giving me fits, so I just printed one-sided and then adhered it to pattern cardstock. For the cover, I'm using an Eileen Hull die called Pocket Notebook, and I'm also going to leave a link to that below. To save time, I've already die cut my pieces. Now you can do this with craft paper, but I've used a lightweight chipboard instead so that my cover will be thicker and it'll feel more like actual leather. Once you try this technique, you'll want to make a ton of these leather covers. I think I made about 20 in my first 2 days. The main ingredient for this technique is a mixture of water and glycerin. You'll use the water and glycerin in a spray bottle. I used a 1 to 5 ratio, with water being the larger amount. I got my glycerin on Amazon, and I'll leave a link to something similar below. The lightweight chipboard I used is from my stash, but you can use a cardboard from a 12 by 12 paper pad or anything similar to that. You can even use craft cardstock, which is actually easier to use. It's just not as thick as leather when you're finished. Let's begin. You want to shake your mixture really well because it does tend to separate in the bottle. Spray each side of your chipboard liberally and let it soak in a bit. I kind of rub mine around and pat it down as well to help it along. Now if you watch other tutorials on this technique, you'll see them using cardstock rather than chipboard, so it does soak up the liquid more quickly and they won't need to help it along like you see me doing here. Once I make sure the entire surface is covered, it's time to wad it up like yesterday's trash. First, however, you'll see me folding the score lines because I forgot to do that before spraying it. The die gives you these score lines. However, if you're using a craft cardstock instead of chipboard, you might need to shim it a bit to get the score lines to show up, because the die itself is designed to cut and score matte board or a medium to heavyweight chipboard. To work the glycerin into the paper, you're going to want to wad it up and crinkle it together over and over like you see me doing here. Wrinkling the paper over and over breaks down the fibers and makes it pliable. Adding the glycerin into the mix seems to keep it soft and pliable even as it dries. I've tried many different faux leather techniques over the years, but this one is the only one where the paper doesn't go back to a stiff and brittle state once it dries. That's why it's perfect for a journal cover. After you've done this, go ahead and flatten your pieces back out on your work surface and repeat the process again. Now on other covers I made, and I'll try and remember to slip a still shot in at the end of this video of the other ones I made, I added some ink at this stage, but I forgot to do that here. What I normally do is I add a bit of the pumice stone distress ink over the entire surface and then repeat the spray and wrinkle process. Doing this gives an additional layer of ink that's actually worked into the chipboard rather than just sitting on top. Once the pieces are soft and pliable, spread them flat again and allow them to dry partially. If they're not pliable like fabric, then repeat the process a 3rd time before you allow it to dry. If you're using chipboard, you'll most likely need a 3rd round. Now let's ink it. I'm going to use pumice stone distress ink as my first layer and let it dry partially with my heat tool. You don't want it to dry fully before you emboss it though. If you emboss the front cover while it's still a little damp, the emboss will dry into the cover, almost training it into that shape. I'm using a retired embossing folder here because I thought it was perfect for this project. It's an Eileen Hull folder, and if she still has some in her Etsy shop, I'll link that below. Now I'm about to do the unthinkable here. You can see that when I put the embossing folder over my cover, it doesn't sit where the image will be centered. So my only solution is to cut it apart. Now don't worry, once you cut apart an embossing folder, all you have to do is line it back up and add some tape at the top and put it back together. For my purpose though, I need to extend the top so that my image can center properly from top to bottom on my cover. All I did was adhere a folded piece of cardstock to the top while it was closed and lined up. This allowed me to emboss it just exactly where I wanted, centered from top to bottom. Now you will notice that when I open it back up, it leaves kind of a line at the top where the folder ends and the paper extender begins. But later I'm just going to pinch that up a little bit and wrinkle it right back up. Let's go ahead and finish the inking now. I'm going to put some music on here and let you watch the process. Once the cover was inked completely, I dried it with my heat tool, and then I was kind of comparing the color to one of the small journals that I made previously. Here's a look at the inside of one of those journals. Now that I know I have my color exactly like I want it, I need to seal it so that it will be somewhat water resistant and smear proof. To do this, I'm adding a clear wax by DIY. Using a brush, I'll work a small amount of the wax into the cover until it's fully saturated. At this point, you'll need to leave it to dry naturally for the wax to set up and cure a bit. If you don't have any clear wax, you can use a bit of coconut oil from the Dollar Tree, but you'll have to do this in several layers and let it set up in between each one to get the similar result as the DIY wax. Now at this stage, I need to make some adjustments to the spine of my die cut pieces. I'm going to line up the top and bottom holes so that I can mark it to add more center holes. This will allow me to sew in my signatures the way that I want to. I'm going to mark the holes with a pencil, and then I'll punch them with a jewelry punch. After that, we're going to go ahead and get our fabric lining ready. I cut this 97-cent Walmart fat quarter into a piece just larger than my cover. Now I know that I created 4 signatures, so that means that I'm going to need 4 sets of holes in my spine. The die cut is created so that you can overlap the holes when you line up the spine. Since there are a total of 6 sets of holes, I know that I need to adhere the pieces overlapping 2 sets to leave me with the 4 sets of holes that I need. Once that's adhered, I'm going to use some cheap PVA school glue to adhere the fabric to the inside of the cover. Not only will the fabric hide the ugly side of the cover, but it will give it greater stability and keep it from tearing. I went ahead and applied the glue to the entire surface with a paintbrush and then just smoothed the fabric over top. I allowed the glue to dry completely just to make sure the fabric wouldn't pull away from the cover, and then I trimmed off all of the excess fabric. This leaves you with a beautiful fabric-lined cover. I really wish you could see how realistic this looks in person. You can see when I fold it just how thick it is and how pliable the chipboard has become. I've decided to go ahead and add some eyelets from my stash to finish off the holes in the spine. And while you're going to notice that the eyelets are not exactly straight at the end, it still looks better than the raw edge holes. At this point, I'm also going to create a template to punch holes in my signatures. Now I know those center eyelets look really bad, but I had to use an old hammer tool because my crocodile is not long enough to reach the center holes. They'll be covered at the end and you won't really see them anyway. I'm going to mark the template and then fold it in half. I can then use this to sit inside each signature so that the holes are lined up perfectly. Once those holes are lined up, I can sew in my signatures. I'm going to go ahead and put the music back on and let you watch the process. we're ready to add in the alphabet designation for each page. You can see that I created a spot in each corner for placement. I counted my pages and then wrote out how many pages I wanted for each letter. This is how I calculated how many of each letter to die cut. The die I'm using here is by iCrafter and is the perfect size for this application. I'm going to leave a link to that die below. I knew I needed at least 2 of most of these letters, so you'll see that I took the lazy way out in die cutting. If you put double-sided tape on a piece of cardstock and put all of the dies on it, you can cut them all out at once. I'll be using my iMend self-mending cutting pad and my Platinum machine to die cut the letters. I'll put links to both of those items below. Once I had enough of these letters die cut, I adhered them to each of the pages. Had I been smart, I would have used some adhesive sheets before I die cut so that I could just peel and stick them on. I'll go ahead and leave a link to some adhesive sheets below so that you can be smarter than I am. I also realized, after I had my letters glued on, that I needed a background color in the little circles. Again, had I been smart, I would have realized this before gluing down the letters. I, however, am not and did not. So here you see me using Distress ink and watercolor painting around each of the letters into the circles. I use green for this to keep it in my camping colors, as I like to call them, and I did this for every letter and every circle. After that, we're pretty much finished. Let's just do a quick flip through. I hope you enjoyed this video and will maybe try to create your own RV park and campsite tracker. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll like this video and subscribe to my channel.